So we're very delighted to welcome the two finest schools from UK and India. That's why they're here today for this 6th international final. From the winners of DM India 2013 are PSBB Secondary School from KK Nagar, Chennai. So can we have a huge round of applause for them? They flew in on Thursday direct from Chennai. They were knackered when they got here, but it's quite a glamorous process, I think, and I think they're excited to be here. And of course, the winners of last year's UK competition, Franklin College from Grimsby. Sadly, Grimsby just came from Grimsby by train, so they had a slightly less sexy journey here to London, but I'm sure they're enjoying it anyway. Now, before we get going and I hand over to my colleague Jason Smith, who's going to chair this international final, a few very important thanks. The competition is made possible by a very wide range of supporters and funders, people who make the competition possible at all levels, from the local level to this international level. And I'd particularly like to thank the competition's primary funder, the Wellcome Trust, who have supported the competition since its start, and also were very supportive when we first took Debating Matters to India back in 2008. We worked in India for the past 6 years with the British Council, our partner there, and again, they made it entirely possible for us to roll the competition out right across India from its inception. That's no mean feat. India's much larger than the UK, thousands and thousands of schools, so we're very appreciative of the British Council's support, and they've been supporting PSBB School in the run-up to this event. And this particular event, this 6th international final, was held in partnership with the Economic and Social Research Council's Global Uncertainties Project, and in particular with their partnership for conflict, crime and security research. And it's one of the reasons we're looking at the issue we are today, which Jason will introduce in a moment. So this is going to be the last Debating Matters International Final in its current format. It will be back in some way, but this is the last UK v India event. The tally currently stands at 3-2 to India, so frankly, no pressure on you to make it a score draw. Or you could just lose it for the UK entirely. So, again, no pressure. And I'm going to stop babbling now and hand over to Jason, because I think he's keen to get going. So good luck to both teams. Great to see such a large audience here. And Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Justine. So, representing India, on my right, arguing for the motion, we should be willing to compromise our privacy in the interests of national and international security. I have Rashi Nagar and Akshay Venkataragavan. Against the motion is Josh Smith and Lily Vesey. So, first of all, Akshay and Rashi, do you want to introduce yourselves to everybody? Tell them what you're into, what you want to, what you're studying, what you like.
Hello, good morning. My name is Akshay Venkataragavan. I know it's a little difficult, but thank you for getting that right. I'm a law student. I study in Symbiosis International Law School in Pune. Pune is in Maharashtra, one of the biggest states of India. And I have been debating since class 7. So I've been doing it for quite some time now. And me and my teammate have been part of the Debating Matters India competition right from the regional finals to the finals in Delhi, and we're very happy to be here. And yeah.
Hi, I'm Rashi. I'm still in school, so I have like a lot of things on my mind, and this is like an amazing opportunity to showcase my point of view and our ideas. And we're really thankful that we had this opportunity to present what we feel that the world should hear. And I think that's about it. Yeah.
Very good. Welcome, Rashi. So, Josh, who are you? What do you like?
I'm Josh Smith. I'm studying British Politics and Legislative Studies at the University of Hull. I hope to go on to some sort of life in politics after university. I'm a paid-up member of the Conservative Party, whether appeals or not. Otherwise, that's probably about it, really.
Fine. Lily?
I'm Lillian Vesey, and I'm doing A2 levels at the minute in Maths, English and History, and I'd love to go to uni and study history at the degree level.
Great stuff. Welcome all. I will just introduce our judges by reading out our biographies. So firstly, on the far left is Professor Kim Knott. Kim is currently leading research on the role of ideologies and beliefs in areas of conflict, risk and insecurity, and is the Global Uncertainties Research Fellow, our sponsor today. She was chair of debating at Comprehensive School in Bristol and spent her woodwork lessons making a gavel, which she's been using to keep order ever since. Welcome, Kim. Next to her, in the middle, is Angela Sahni. Angela is an award-winning science journalist and author of Geek Nation, a former BBC News reporter. She's now a frequent presenter on BBC Radio science programmes. Dolan Cummins, closest to me, is an associate fellow of the Institute of Ideas. He's one of the co-founders of the Manifesto Club, a campaign group for freedom in everyday life. So, the motion: we should be willing to compromise our privacy in the interests of national and international security. Akshay, I believe you're going to kick us off arguing for the motion. As you know, you have 3 minutes to make your opening arguments, and I will bang on the table after 2.5 minutes to let you know that you need to start winding up. I will start the clock when you start speaking.
A giant panda walks into a bar and orders for fries and a burger and a drink. He eats his food, turns around, pulls out a gun and shoots everybody in the bar and pays the bartender, and he's on the way out and the bartender asks him, "Why, panda? Why did you kill everybody in this room?" And then the panda replies to him, "Haven't you heard what we pandas are? We pandas eat, shoot and leaves." That is interpretation, ladies and gentlemen. And this debate is about interpretation. And from side proposition, we believe that interpreting security, interpreting privacy, interpreting the word compromise, as well as national and international security is detrimental in proving to you that you should side with us. And our 4 constructive arguments in today's debate are: number 1, a reality check that I should give you on the current status quo that's happening. Number 2, need versus want. Number 3, which my second speaker will be handling, privacy as a concept. And finally, for the greater good, ladies and gentlemen, why you should side with team proposition in today's debate. Before I move on to the first constructive argument, let me draw some basic definitions. Privacy we define as a state of being free from public attention. National and international security we define as a situation of crisis created by external or internal forces that threaten the sovereignty of a nation as well as societal balance, including but not limited to terrorism, crimes, etc. Now, moving on to my first constructive argument in today's debate, which I'm going to give you a reality check, ladies and gentlemen. We are at war. I know that's straight out of a Batman movie, but you need to analyze what's happening in the world today, right? We need to take the threat of what's happening seriously, because we simply do not seem to understand that we are at war. And who are we at war with? A faceless enemy, ladies and gentlemen, that has hundreds and thousands of means and supports and somehow still exists, even though he or she is detrimental in destroying our nation. And who is supposed to fight against this faceless enemy, ladies and gentlemen? Who is supposed to win this war for us, ladies and gentlemen? Us, side government. That is why it's very important for you to understand the concept of need versus want, which is my second point today. Once I've established that we are at war, right? Let us look at the logical fallacy and the huge difference between the need and the want in today's debate. There is a need for lesser crimes, right? There is a need for lesser terror attacks. There is a need for societal balance. Yes, we agree. But what do you want, ladies and gentlemen? That you want privacy. So can these two go together is a question that we ask you today. Right? Because as a government, we have an inherent duty of protection. Salus populi suprema lex, which is a legal term which means as a government we are justified in compromising on privacy. Because the importance of the word compromise here is that you have 3 alternatives. You have no security, you have sacrifice of security, and you have compromise, ladies and gentlemen. What is the best scenario for us today? What is the best way forward? Because as Sun Tzu said, victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while the defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. We seek to win, but we decide to be prepared, ladies and gentlemen. Go with side proposition today. Thank you so much.
Josh, over to you.
The proposition have argued that this debate is a simple exchange, a choice between privacy and security. We here today will argue the contrary, that in fact the premise of their argument is wrong. This isn't a debate about more privacy or more security. We will demonstrate that more privacy leads to more security. Furthermore, my colleague will debunk the myth that invasion of privacy leads to improvements in national and international security. Our argument is simple. Improved security actually means improved privacy. The development of privacy has been a cornerstone of the development of Western civilization. All the great struggles and advances throughout history have been fought on the battlefield of human rights in an attempt to create a decent private life. From the French Revolutions and the Declaration of Independence from America and the drafting of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, men and women have laid down their lives for the pursuit of improved rights, including the right to a private life. The recent spate of leaks by the likes of Edward Snowden, Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning have been met by indifference because people have been duped into believing that it is a simple exchange between privacy and security. We have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to protect? Surely we are trying to protect more than the lives of the people in the state. Surely we are trying to protect the ideas of the state. What makes the state worth living in? Ideas that if we compromise, we'll end up destroying. As a society, we have reached a crucial tipping point. The time to make a choice of what sort of society we want to live in cannot be deferred any longer, and we need to make this choice as fully informed individuals. The only way for us to collectively safeguard the values that we hold most dear is to live by these values, embody them, and win the moral argument. We'll never stop schoolgirls from Bristol running away to become martyrs unless we win the argument and sell a way of life that is more appealing than any of the alternatives. Communism in Vietnam was defeated not by overwhelming American force, but by overwhelming American culture. The war on terror is exactly the same. The scaremongering of the proposition needs to be exposed and seen for what it is, the self-defeating, uninformed, populist, short-term solution which actually, as my colleague shall demonstrate, is no solution at all. Thank you.
While you sleep peacefully, someone out there is fighting your battles for you. It's now not a matter of if, but rather when and where the next terror attack will take place. As the world awakens to this reality of being at war, and permanently so, we must recognize that today our enemies are far more sophisticated than the bearded jihadist. In fact, it is a well-concealed, tech-savvy, web-surfing zealot. We must rebuff the privacy bogey because in the war against terror, there is no free lunch. To paraphrase Justice Jackson, the choice is not between security and privacy. It's between liberty with order or anarchy without either. So let us deconstruct this chimera of privacy. Philosophically, privacy is not an absolute truth. Rather, it is dynamic and amorphous, tempered by country, culture, and context. Historically, since Aristotle, there is disagreement over whether privacy refers to something fundamental or is it a stitching together of diverse elements with a superficial connection. Socially also, there is no privacy without security. Ladies and gentlemen, just compare yourselves to the citizens of Iraq, Syria, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Count your blessings that somebody is fighting your war. Politically as well, it is subservient to the social contract of voluntary surrender of individual freedom in exchange of security by the political authority. It's high time public policy rebalances the tension between security and privacy. As President Obama said, you can't have 100% security and 100% privacy with zero inconvenience. Yes, there is a necessity for a trade-off, as the opposition mentioned, but not as a zero-sum game, but a dynamic and symbiotic relationship which my worthy opponents have failed to realize. It's time there is an engendering of responses which are modern and don't see a boogeyman behind every algorithm, as if it is the size which makes Big Brother big. Instead, let's shed this hypocrisy. Privacy died at the beginning of the cyber age, much before Prism, Drip, or Snowden. The entry of Facebook, Twitter, Google has completely redefined what we today perceive privacy to be. And surveillance with a little compromise has produced results. President Obama confirmed that post 9/11, more than 54 terrorist plots had been dismantled, including a bombing of the New York Stock Exchange. Here in UK, GCHQ claims more than 34 plots were unraveled due to the extended surveillance. Global citizens realize that there are few, if any, absolutes in life, and the right to privacy is definitely not one of them. Despite all of this, it's nice to know that the NSA is probably the only government body that listens. Thank you.
Thank you. When you're ready, Lily.
As my colleague has argued, the notion that we have a choice between our civil liberties and national security is false. There is no such dichotomy. Invasions of the private sphere do not improve our security. All this approach does is drive those who threaten our way of life further underground whilst alienating and disempowering innocent citizens who happen to fit the security service's racial profile. Modern terrorism evolves too rapidly and is too sophisticated to be effectively controlled through listening into some mobile phone calls or reading thousands of emails. Serious terrorists already operate in the totally unregulated and unregulatable dark web. The proposition's claim that sacrificing privacy is worthwhile is based on some quasi-utilitarian calculation, which can only be sustained by a partial reading of the available evidence. Security is a multi-billion-pound industry, and there are clear vested interests in expanding both the power and astronomical budgets of these agencies. The proposition has been banding around lots of statistics relating to the prevention of acts of terrorism, but this evidence is supplied by the very people who have the most to lose if the myth that invading people's liberties and rights leads to gains in security is finally disproved. An objective reading of the empirically verifiable data produces a very different set of conclusions. This is not a war on terror, but a culture war that can only be won by discussion, debate, and morally superior ideas. Mass data collection is the government storing all sorts of information in the hope that it will be useful at some point in the future. Besides the fact this is a massive waste of resources, we have two further objections. Firstly, we do not know what this and future governments will use this data for, but we should be wary of blindly trusting those in authority to benevolently use information which could be used to consolidate their position or persecute a minority group. Secondly, even if the data is never used by the government for illegitimate purposes, we can't say the same for the other groups who will almost invariably gain access to at least some of these records because the past record of the government in protecting this information is worse than appalling. When it comes to governments and data security, the only thing we can be certain of is that the data is not secure. What's the point of life without living? We could live in a police state, but that is no life at all. As Benjamin Franklin said, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. We have made it clear that we do not need to choose between privacy and security, because more privacy means more security, and that is why we implore you to support us and defeat today's motion.
Great stuff. Well done, everyone. So, easy bit over. We now find out what you really understand by this motion. So, judges, your questions, please, for PSB arguing for the motion. Kim, could I start with you, please?
I'd like to press you on the issue of what we will lose in this equation. So, you've talked a little bit about privacy, no privacy without security and so on. The voluntary surrender of privacy by the citizen. I mean, I think the citizen might want to debate that voluntary surrender. But according to Robin Kerner in the Huffington Post, there's more at stake than privacy if we accept the kind of surveillance and security regimes and systems that are currently before us. what he's saying is that we're also required to sacrifice freedom of speech and the right to due process, so that it isn't just a question of sacrificing privacy and voluntarily submitting to surveillance, giving over our privacy. So how are you going to guarantee that I will not also have to sacrifice freedom of speech and the right to due process?
Nolan.
Some very interesting arguments made. Rashi, you said that there's no privacy without security. I think maybe I'd like you to elaborate a bit on that. What do you mean by that exactly? And maybe with reference to those countries that you mentioned, are you saying that there is no privacy in those countries? Could you explain? And then, Akshay, you made this, you talked a lot about compromise and the meaning of compromise. I wonder if you give an example, because it's a little bit abstract. Can you give an example? What kind of liberty do you think we should be willing to sacrifice? And what is a kind of a level of privacy that we should not be willing to sacrifice?
Angela.
There's always grey area in between this, and I'd love to explore the grey area. When you think that we don't need privacy because the government needs it more, the state needs it more, then where do you draw that line? So do we have the right to any privacy at all? Where would you say that what is private and what isn't private? And Arushi, you made this lovely point about privacy died at the start of the cyber age, which sounds very snappy, but what if you're not online? There are plenty of people who aren't online. Does that mean they automatically have the right to more privacy? And is that a choice that we should be actively making if we want our privacy? Does that mean we have to actively choose not to use the internet anymore?
Ma'am, answering your first question about there being more at stake in privacy, and are we also required to sacrifice freedom of speech as such? Is it a slippery slope? Will it lead for us to sacrificing our speech, etc.? It's a very valid question, but I'll answer this to you in a system that we call checks and balances, right? Inherently, every government, every nation has a system of checks and balances thanks to two things in life. We as human beings love to blame one another. We as human beings love to keep others in check. It's an inherent nature of us. That is why that even if a government is going to go rogue, even if a government is not going to do its job, you're going to have two things pegging it back. You're going to have the fifth estate, which is the media, pinging it back. You're going to have the Congress itself, which is not only considering of the majority ruling government, which is going to realize that they are actually making a mistake and hence going to make sure that there is never a situation where we have to sacrifice the freedom of speech.
In the case of US, where you have FISA courts, etc., where unless you have reasonable proof to show that such and such person is involved in terrorist activity, you're not granted a warrant to tap their interior conversations. So essentially what's happening now is your metadata, which is the contents, or we could compare it to an envelope. So right now, the government is looking at the cover of the envelope, your address, the person you are talking to, the duration of that call, when it was made, etc. But right now, the government cannot look at what you said unless they have reasonable proof and they have reason to believe that the contents of that conversation were detrimental to society. In that case, they would have to apply for a warrant, which would be granted by the court. So without the court warrant, they are not able to access the contents of the conversation.
The final point I would like to add is that we make the government, right? So if the government is not going to give us the freedom of speech, we make the government. We are going to keep that in check. It is an inherent system of checks and balances.
I understand what you're saying. I think some of us might be a bit more dubious about our leaders than this would suggest. And if you think back to the Snowden case, it was a long time before a lot of the information about the systems of surveillance that are actually operating apparently in our name, that it was a long time before they actually came to light in the public realm. So exactly. I think you're asking for us to be very trusting of those in power. And I think many people would be quite dubious about that.
And ma'am, just to add on to what you said, in fact, the reason why this was kept in the dark for so long was now we all know that our phones are being tapped. We all know that our emails are being read. And so do the terrorists, so do people who are being involved in such activities. So that was one of the reasons why this was kept under the wraps, so as to create an environment wherein, as we mentioned earlier, more than 54 terrorist plots were stopped. In fact, another 2611 in India was about to take place, which was successfully handled. In fact, in India, over the past 10 years, there have been more than 40 terrorist attacks. But post 26/11, which was the bombings in Bombay, we've had a sharp decline because we increased our surveillance, we improved our technology, and we created a system wherein we were able to tackle these antisocial elements in an efficient manner. Ma'am, and regarding your question about where to draw that line, the first thing I'd like to say is that, as the topic suggests, we are compromising our privacy, we're not sacrificing the privacy. So I think that line is drawn when we start, as ma'am had pointed out, to trust that government in power, to realize that the things they're doing is for the greater good, to ensure that a greater problem, because the right to privacy is not an absolute right. It's a relative concept. It could vary from you to me. So to ensure the protection of that right versus the greater good of the nation, I think the line drawn there would emphasize more on the security of the nation than on the individual's privacy.
And answering your question about the importance of compromise in this debate, as I've drawn out, I would repeat it with a better way of saying it. There are three alternatives in front of you, right? You have no security, you have compromising, and then you have sacrifice of security, right? Let us analyze this a little further. No security in the sense that you are simply not going to have any security. Is our society evolved enough to let go of surveillance as such, telling that terrorists will be cultured enough not to attack us? That's no security for you. Sacrifice of security is the other alternative, where the government completely shuts it down and sacrifices every person's privacy just so that they can make the surveillance better. We say no to that too. That is why the middle, the gray area in this entire debate is the word compromise, where we believe that there should not be no security, there should not be no sacrifice. There should be compromise between privacy and surveillance, which is the best middle area that we can reach in today's debate and conclusion.
I mean, I would say that terrorists, they employ the techniques that they do because they know that governments aren't going to go down those avenues. So the reason that they use cyber warfare, maybe, is because governments just aren't fast enough to keep up with them. But if terrorist techniques keep one step ahead of your privacy, and that the governments, in response, keep demanding more of your privacy, how do you know that they're not going to keep doing that forever until you have no privacy left?
Ma'am, I think at this point we should realize what we value more. Do we value the security of our nation, national as well as international, or do we value the contents of an email? I mean, if you look at it in perspective, you'll realize that there is no use of having that contents of your email safe if the world around you is in shambles, right? So we should realize what we value more. And in fact, it's like saying, who would you rather have storming into your house? The security guard or the murderer? That's what we'd like to say. And sir, extending on to what you said about how the nations like Iran, Iraq, where would they place it? I think that current situation is such that I don't think they would value their privacy over security, because for them, the first thing they'll have to do is create a stable and balanced environment where they're able to proceed further, join the entire global village that we've created. So currently, they're like outside the entire process and the progress which the world is facing. So first, their ultimate aim would be to first get rid of all these externalities, after which I think this entire concept of privacy, I think, is a privilege which only developed and safer nations experience. Today, we're able to sit and talk about privacy because no one's bombing us outside. But in countries like these, where already the security situation is very precarious, I think the entire issue of privacy is secondary, and security would be the primary concern there. So I hope that answers your question.
Could you just give an example? Because you spoke about the example of needing a court order to read emails for. I mean, is that where you would lie? Do you think now, in the interest of security, that government should be allowed to read anyone's email at random because they think that, or would you say no, that's not allowed? They need the evidence, just to be a bit more concrete.
Yeah. So there's the system of wiretaps, which is if you feel that the person involved has connections to detrimental people, then you'll have to have a minimum of 3 dirty calls or 3 dirty conversations, 3 links of a minimum to establish that these people are involved in such activities, after which you'll be able to proceed with your warrant or your wiretap. So there is a standard which is established, and there's the privacy board which oversights on transparency in the US, the FISA courts in the US. So there are these establishments which have been created after the concerns that you pointed out. That people had these concerns. We all have these concerns, which is why the government, which I hope is not as dubious as they seem, but which is why they created this, so that there is some reassurance for us as the public. So I hope that answers your question.
Judges, we'll move on to questions for Josh and Lily.
Maybe I could pursue a point made by the other side, steal one of their arguments, and ask you why we shouldn't just get rid of privacy as a good or virtue today, given that the conditions in which we're living have changed so much. You know, why don't we instead get used to living in a world where everything is open, you know, the Facebook world where everything is open, where privacy isn't an issue, and where we're comfortable with that kind of openness. So haven't we already really relinquished this right that you're talking about in the online environment?
I'm going to do the same. The other side made a very good point that governments have claimed directly that surveillance and intruding on our privacy in some ways has helped prevent terrorist attacks. What evidence, you claim that that wasn't the case, what evidence do you have for that? And if you don't have evidence for it, I'd like to know, would you be willing to withstand terrorist attacks if you knew that a compromise of your privacy would be required to stop them?
You both snuck in a line along the lines of more privacy creates more security, which sounds like a really killer argument if you can make it, but you haven't made it. So can you explain how more privacy creates more security?
Okay. I'd firstly like to answer Kim's question, which was, why don't we just get rid of privacy altogether? And there's 3 basic points for this. Obviously, it's a right. Secondly, there are things that innocent people still want to hide, fundamental things. You know, some people have medical histories they don't want to share with the world, or even something like they're seeking other employment and they don't want their boss to know that. And then there's things like privacy allows us to think about political thoughts. It's very undemocratic if people think that people are listening into them, that they can self-censor, and this can change the way people act, and you know that's totally wrong. And 3, it just doesn't work in terms of security.
I'd like to answer Angela's questions on about the statistics. A lot of statistics we need to be very cautious about trusting, and there's inherent discrepancies in statistics. But if you look at a lot of topics where statistics are used as evidence, there'll be statistics from one group on one side, statistics from another group on another side, and statistics from a group in the middle. What we're talking about here has statistics from only one group, a group with an amazing invested interest in having these statistics. What we're saying that you simply can't rely purely on the statistics, and we need to talk about this as a abstract idea, an abstract question of privacy versus security. And if you were to do that, we believe that you come to the logical conclusion of more privacy equals more security, which is Dolan's question. The reason we assert that more privacy equals more security is that privacy is an essential part of the Western civilization we've created, the liberal civilization we've created, a civilization that has converted and won wars better than the actual means of wars. Take the example back to Vietnam of what won the war in Vietnam was not American military power, but was American values. It was the capitalist and liberal ideas that came with it. But if you take what is essentially a police state, Iraq during occupation, 2003 to 2013, during that time, there was occupying armies, there was drones flying overhead, there was constant surveillance, yet there was 34,500 deaths from car bombs alone. That's terrorist action. It just proves that even if you were to take it to the extreme, even if you do remove all privacy, you don't improve security. I mean, it can be seen time and time again. I mean, to make an analogy with the US Secret Service, they say that the largest threat to the president is a lone gunman. The largest threat to society is often a lone individual or a small group of individuals who can act under the radar, who can act quickly and can act on their own and cause horrific damage.
Can we come back? Yeah. To go back to you, Lily, and what you were saying in answer to my points, privacy is a right, but I mean, security really is a right as well. You know, we have a range of differential rights. I wasn't convinced really, though, by the fact that you put on the table this idea of self-censoring, because I think that surely being a citizen requires all sorts of kinds of self-discipline, and self-censorship is part of what it is, in a way, to be a citizen. So, you know, speaking our mind on every occasion is not really the activity of a responsible citizen. So you need to give me a bit more on the idea of privacy as a right in and of itself. We've already heard the other side saying it's not an absolute right, but also on this question of self-censoring. You know, what's wrong with self-censoring?
It's not that we have to speak views on every issue. It's more that there are often behaviours or views that are unpopular in society, or there is a stigma attached to them. And this doesn't mean that these views are wrong or that these behaviours are wrong. But self-censorship in the way that it's important to give views a platform, because if you give views a platform, then they can be discussed, and if they are extreme and if they are wrong, they will be shut down by real thought and real debate. But if we think back in the past, the idea of women's equality was an outrageous and silly idea. You know, that was an extreme view. But we gave it a platform and we've discussed it, and actually developed
isn't that
society.
freedom of speech rather than privacy?
It comes back to that if you're restricting people's privacy, you're opening them up to the whole of society. The views that they hold that are maybe on the fringe of society are viewed by a group of people as unacceptable. They become unwilling to develop, they become unwilling to discuss, and they self-censor. Self-censorship in that sense, obviously it does have some uses, but in that sense it's dangerous. I mean, it can hamper society. If you take one of the...
Isn't that precisely the kind of thing that goes on behind the closed doors of privacy? You know, privacy kind of enables those kind of... you know, those kind of views to be hot-housed and so on, to be inaccessible to others.
It allows them, I would argue, and Lily would probably argue, that it allows them to be developed. It allows them, you can't develop fringe ideas, you can't develop yourself as an individual if you don't have any private sphere. And it's something that John Stuart Mill argued back in the 1850s. It's something that's essential for self-development and the development of ideas as a society.
You talked about Western values winning wars, and it's a bit of a stretch to say that America won the Vietnam War even after the event. I mean, the military lost. But I take your point. There was a cultural change that did happen. But let's take one war that the West definitely did win, the Second World War, won by the US and Britain and its allies. Do you think we could have won the Second World War if they'd respected the privacy of the Germans? Or even if they'd been unwilling to compromise the privacy of their own citizens? There's a huge intelligence network involved in any war. Don't you think that everyone agreed that compromise at least was essential?
I think that it's a very different time now that we're living in. I mean, the World War II was a total war. It was a war without limits, a war that stretched all over the globe. We're not fighting a war in the conventional sense now. Although there are some troops on the ground, there is not mass armies facing up against each other, trying to defeat one another in open battle. What we're fighting is a war in the shadows, a war in the shadows where you can starve off their resources, their men, their manpower, by winning a culture war. By making them more appealed by our society, our values, our culture, than by their supposed culture that they would like to implement on us through violent means.
Quick last word, Lily.
And of course, the Second World War was fought in defence of the human rights and liberties that we hold most as well. It's for those values.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, audience, over to you.
This is for the proponents. The compromise you're asking me to make is with my privacy, okay? But in actual fact, there is no privacy, there is no compromise for those people who want to keep things secret, because there is a thing called Tor, the onion ring. So if I am a terrorist and I want to bomb somewhere, I'm going to be conducting my communications through the onion ring. So the people like me who are not doing that are being asked to compromise their security. For what reason exactly?
So this question is for the opponents. You've talked a lot about human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not actually list privacy as a human right. It only lists the right to not be subjected to arbitrary interference with privacy. So surely interference with privacy in the interests of national security is not arbitrary and therefore doesn't constitute a violation of human rights?
My question is to the proponents. You said earlier that would you rather have someone who, an agent of the security forces of the state bursting through your door, or would you rather have a murderer bursting through your door? I'd like to put it to you that the two are not mutually exclusive, and that in many places across the world, the agents of the state are the murderers, and that the terrorists, or those we perceive as terrorists, are those working for the freedom of the people. So perhaps, if I can think of an example, so in the UK, the security services, Martin Lawrence's mother campaigned for a long time against institutional racism. The police response to that was to track her, to put surveillance on her. Sorry, I'll finish quickly.
Yeah.
And then destroy the files afterwards. So I put it to you that the state, those we view as security, are not always security.
Question for the proponents. Can you tell me if international security is the same as national security? Question for the others. If you've accepted the principle that war goes into the shadows, don't we have to police the shadows, and that means you must end up policing privacy?
It's kind of like a point for both sides. You've spoken about government versus terrorists. I basically want to make you both aware and see if you can elaborate on the fact that it's not just the government versus terrorists, this discussion. Companies have access to this as well. For example, in the last week, Apple and Google decided to encrypt their smartphones. So the government doesn't really have a choice in the fact that privacy is winning in that case. Just expand the debate a bit more to not just be along those lines.
This question is to the proposition. I found something quite deeply disturbing in one of the question responses between you and the judges. You had stated that it's almost universally accepted that security is more valuable than rights such as the right to privacy. How would you respond to the likes of Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela, who put their life on the line for the rights we have, such as the right to privacy?
Hello, I'm obviously not as bright as all of you because I'm not 100% sure what privacy is. I don't feel it's been made clear enough. So my question is for the opposers. What exactly are you trying to protect? You've said medical history. Well, big data knows this. Social media knows this. You talked about you're planning to leave your employment. Actually, even algorithms can tell that you plan to leave employment. You've talked about stifling free thought of fringe ideas of fringe people, but have you been on YouTube lately? I mean, what are you protecting? I feel like we're talking mainly about cyber privacy, right? Reading my emails and things like that. You're not talking about going into my bedroom and seeing what I do first thing in the morning before everyone's woken up. I mean, I'm sure you can guess, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what I'm doing on the internet. But everyone knows this already, so what are you trying to protect?
I would like to answer the first question of the presence of onion rings and the entire deeper organizations that we have not paid adherence to. But its argument is very simple, right? Let us look at the proportion of the people who actually use this onion ring. Let us look at the proportion of terror attacks, that the magnitude that we have potentially stopped using the existing mechanism. We already gave you two statistics. 40 bombings was happened in India prior to the surveillance. And similarly, the President Obama has released a statement, over 50 terror attacks have been prevented using this surveillance. I would love to consider these terrorists to be these really sophisticated, advanced people, but if they were indeed, like you say they were, and using the onion ring, etc., ladies and gentlemen, the entire statistics that I would be giving to you would be different. The statistics I would be giving to you, was that the case, would be that 50,000 people were dead right today because we have been surveilling the wrong area. But fortunately we have, and that is why statistics proves right for us today.
And also, I feel that we're looking at a very microscopic part of this entire topic. So the amount of people who are on that fringe, the amount of extremists we have, not everyone, as you pointed out, not everyone's using that particular method of communication. So there are people, including, for example, the Boston Marathon bombings and the potential New York Stock Exchange bombings, where they're using normal communication systems. They're talking on the phone like you and I. So in such situations, considering we have potentially stopped so many of them, I think it's best that we continue on this path until we reach that hopeful place where we wouldn't have to have this debate because everything would be perfect. Now, another point I'd like to mention is, again, extending on the security force. That is, the cases wherein the government are the villains and the so-called fringe elements are the heroes. Again, this is a very microscopic view because this isn't true for all the cases. Of course, if that's the case, then I think that's an entirely different debate to have. But in this debate, taking a general view, looking at what the majority of countries are facing and what the situation is like in its entirety, I feel that the stand we have taken today is what should have been taken and what is the right stand to take. And also the question about there being no middle ground in privacy. It's either there or not there. A very simple example. On our trip here, when we passed airport security in India, for women, we are frisked in a separate chamber where it's curtained all around. So there they believe that the woman's body or frisking, etc., should be done privately because she has the right to privacy for her body. But the same thing in the UK or possibly Dubai, etc., where we transited, was done in the open. So again, this is another extension of the point that here they didn't feel that they were violating someone's privacy by frisking them in the open, whereas in India, if they'd done the same, it would have been a violation of privacy. So again, it's a very relative concept we are talking about. There's no hard and fast ground. There is that variance there. And again, the right to privacy is not a fundamental right. As one of the audience members pointed out, it's not there in the UN Declaration. It's not there in most constitutions of the world. It's a right which is kind of hiding behind the right to life. So it's not absolute. The right to life is absolute. Even the right to free speech is not absolute. So right to privacy should definitely not be taken as one of the absolute rights.
If you prove to me and show me a legal court case where the judge has actually given a verdict saying yes or no, yes to a right, no to a right, I will downright lose this debate today, ladies and gentlemen. Because fact proves that every right has to an extent need to be analyzed further than just yes or no. That is why they are a right, because a right to you may not be a right to me.
There will be reasonable restrictions, is what we're trying to say.
Moving on, is international security the same as national security, right? Definitely, this is a very interesting question and we would like to answer this in a twofold argument, right? Is international security important and is national security important? Definitely, yes. Let us look at two-part analysis. India, that we look at our nation, hence we're more comfortable with that. Let us tell you the national security aspect of India and as a global forum, right? Definitely not. In terms of security as such or in terms of privacy, international security has way larger means of communication than national security. But national security is no less important, ladies and gentlemen, because unless you have national stability, you're not going to attain international stability. It's only the logical movement.
I'd like to answer the question from up there, so I didn't catch a name. It was around the 12th article, I believe, of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I'll read it out so everybody understands what precisely it is. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honour and reputation. Everyone has the right to protection under the law against such interferences or attacks. What we would say today is that what the proposition are proposing is very much arbitrary interference and very much arbitrary attacks on some people's privacy. There are there are US admirals that support the idea, for example, for the idea that it's ineffective, it's essentially a waste of money to spend the billions of dollars. The US budget last year was $71 billion on a system which is broadly ineffective, and that we certainly cannot guarantee the effectiveness of, especially when measures of spreading a value system and Western civilization have proved throughout history far more effective.
The second question was about war going into the shadows. War has gone into the shadows, but we can't police these shadows, which are places like the dark web. We can't. So rather than infringing on people's rights to no avail, we need a cultural change, which is what we're arguing. That is the only effective method to combat this kind of threat.
I mean, there's a very good analogy with the Ebola crisis at the moment. People get very scared when there are terrorist attacks, understandably, and they want a response from central government. In the Ebola crisis, they wanted checking at airports, even though all the international organisations suggested that actually this was an incredibly ineffective way of catching Ebola on transiting passengers. It's the same thing with mass surveillance. People are scared and they're willing to give up their rights. We've seen it throughout history time and time again. People give them up in an instant, and then years down the line they can't take them back, because it's so often the case that once rights are given up, they are not returned, even in a time of peace.
And then if we move on to the third question that we received, was what are we trying to protect? Well, one of the things is we're trying to protect data from getting into the hands of people, not just the government, but also when the government loses it, because it will. And not everyone does share their medical history on Facebook.
A sort of more broad question from the audience, I forget where it was from, apologies, but it was about what is privacy? And we would define privacy as what Mill defined privacy as the difference between self and other regarding actions. Obviously, it's not simple and as plain as that. There's also important contexts involved, and also incitements to harm and violence that also need to be taken into context. It's very much on a case-by-case basis. There cannot be one sweeping statement of what privacy is. But that is what we want to protect at the core, the difference between self and other regarding actions.
Okay, I understand you've got a question you want to put to these guys.
Yeah. I'd just like to know what your response to this is. Admiral Mike Mullen, who's the former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs of the United States, said that the single greatest threat to our national security is our debt. So how is the proposition promoting measures that are not only ineffective and infringe on privacy rights, but cost so much they're actually a threat to security themselves?
Ma'am, this is simple and we will answer this in a two-part argument. The first one I'd like to make today is simple. We value the lives of our citizens. It is infinite. You can't place a price tag over the safety of our citizens. We would not mind spending any amount of money, how much ever we can, on surveillance, provided it helps keep our citizens safe. Because we deserve, or we owe that much to our citizens today, because it is, after all, they who make us, right? So we would like to dismiss this statement or this fallacy that you have that we are number one a threat to privacy, which we are not. We're actually aiding privacy, because against the war of terror, if we stop the war, there can be privacy like you claim there to be. And secondly, I would like to state that we do not put a cap on the lives of our citizens, which is why we believe that is supreme.
So you put literally no cap on protecting the lives of your citizens. Presumably then, you would live in a Hobbesian state where all the state protects is life. That's all you care about, life. No matter what that life is like, no matter what the comforts or no comforts there are, all you care about, simply and unquestionably, is the lives of your citizens.
Which is essentially what we're trying to say. All the opposition cares about is privacy. And what use of that privacy is, what's the use of that privacy if you're living in an unstable country where you don't know if you're going to survive for the next day? If tomorrow UK becomes a country like Iran, Iraq or Syria, where people are not able to even, they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. whether they'll be able to cross that street without being hit by a bomb. So if the situation comes to that, then yes, we value life, 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 and life.
Okay, do you want to ask?
So the question we have has two parts. First of all, you said that...
That's two questions then.
So firstly, you said that increased privacy means increased security. But increased privacy also means increased anonymity, which essentially means that you're facilitating an anonymous environment for the growth of such externalities. And also, when you talk about the cyber world, websites like Facebook and Google, you're okay with them tracking you and using your data for advertising Dunkin' Donuts and Krispy Kreme, but you're not okay with the government using that data to save another or stop up another potential 9/11.
So we're not okay with Facebook and Google acting that way, and also you keep referring to the surface web and have absolutely no disregard for the actual threat that is dark web, which is much more dangerous to us.
It's keen to point out that, broadly speaking, terrorists are not bumbling buffoons. They are highly organised. They have serious political statements that they want to make through violent means, and they are prepared to use extreme violence to do so. They will be using, and they do use, the dark web to do so, like international drug dealers do, and such like. It's untraceable, unpoliceable, and completely anonymous. It cannot be policed. That's why we need to stop people even going to it to do to become terrorists.
If I could just
and you do that through a cultural change.
Don't be polite.
So we just stop. Let them do what they're doing. Let's increase privacy so there's even more anonymity, so the dark web grows even more, and let's just watch.
No, I think you misunderstand. Let's stop blaming the failings of security agencies on the right to privacy. Let's actually look at them and realise they're not working. Let's try something else.
Could you provide us with some facts that the security agencies aren't working? Because we've given you proof to show that they have foiled so many terror attacks.
Well, there's any number of terrorist attacks that you can evidence to prove that intelligence agencies are not working. I mean, 9/11, 7/7. I mean,
Boston bombings.
Boston bombings. I mean, there's clear proof that they do not work all the time because
But you've taken like 4 years between each attack, and for just so that the audience as well as the judges know, with regard to the Boston bombings, the suspects were able to be cornered and were killed during a shoot down, thanks to the fact that the NSA had them on their alert list and they were able to determine their exact location.
So you've inconvenienced them slightly, but you haven't stopped them, have you?
Ma'am, the question that we finally ask you today is, you ask us, request us to make the societal jump, make the leap of faith saying increasing privacy will increase security, but the question we ask you today, when modern terrorism, as you quote, has advanced so much, how can we take the leap of faith by jumping into utmost privacy when we do not have security as basic as this?
There's a cheeky extra question there, isn't there?
I think it's simply delusional to expect just increasing security will decreasing privacy will increase security. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq had an army occupying it of 250,000 men, and there were 34,500 deaths due to car bombings. It's not that simple. It's a false dichotomy to think that it is that simple.
Which is
we
exactly
need
what
a new tack. We need a new approach.
So time for a few more questions.
Well, I was talking about like how kind of taking our text messages and emails is going to like provide information to help national security. But do we know whether it's going to? Do we know the methods used to kind of help this national security? Do we know what our privacy is going to be used for? And so it's kind of like there's holes in this national security. So you look at personal security, and for me, privacy is personal security. So it's kind of like it's a bit kind of like weighing up like what is the security here?
I have a question for both teams. My first goes to the proponents, which is your defence of privacy is given as a force to stop terrorism. However, many bills that have been put forward, specifically in the US, like SOPA, are funded by private corporations in order to inhibit freedom of speech and in defence of intellectual property rather than against terrorism. So why should we say that security should be valued like this when the people that are proposing these things are corporations and the 1%? And then my question for the opponents are, Tor and Onion are mystified to the point where deep web propaganda is fear-mongering. Yes, all of these crimes happen on Onion and Tor. However, they happen on the surface web at the same time. Saying we can't police the shadows is, well, firstly, it's ridiculous because you can, actually do it. People can do that. But why are we not dealing with the surface problem at the moment? Because, for instance, Skype has been proven to support trafficking rings. So why aren't we policing that first?
Organised criminals do find a way against surveillance and security. So to counterattack that, would the government increase security until we have no privacy left?
This is your last chance to show the judges that you deserve to be the winners tonight. So, in the same order in which we started, you've got a minute summation. So, I'll bang on the table after 30 seconds to let you know you need to start winding up. So, Akshay, off you go.
There is an inherent system of checks and balances. Who polices the police? Well, it's the media, well, it's the Congress. There is a deterrence factor because every terrorist out there knows that there is surveillance happening and he or she, irrespective of how or what means he chooses to adopt, we will find him and we will hunt him down. And yes, I've proven to you that compromise is better. But what have they told you today, ladies and gentlemen? More privacy means more security. For who? Only for you. But what about more surveillance? Means more security for all, for the government, for the nation, for the greater good, which is what we like to propose today. Nobody is going to broadcast that I did not brush my teeth today, but we love our citizens. We want to open our society to culture. We want to open our society the same thing that they want to do. But is it the time to do it now, ladies and gentlemen? It isn't. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by tackling the question regarding the girl who ran away to join IS from Bristol. She ran away to join IS because she could become a martyr's husband. This would have afforded her a good life. It meant she was cared for the rest of her life. This is precisely the case that we can stop by winning a war of values, by ensuring that the society that we live in and the society that we occupy is better than the opposition society. Values have been one of the greatest weapons the West has had in its fights around the world. From Vietnam to Korea, all the way through to Iraq and Afghanistan. It will be Western values and Western society that is the true appeal and true change for the better. The scaremongering of the proposition cannot be listened to. Or they are scaring people into believing that it is a simple choice when it just is not.
Thank you. Arush.
People today vacillate over national security and government power. We want an efficient intelligence community, but we don't want too much surveillance or collection of data. We want to rein in the NSA, but we also act outraged when it doesn't connect the dots. We want to kill the enemy, but drone strikes make us uncomfortable. The further we get from 9/11/7/7, the further and the less tolerant we become of strong government action to prevent future attacks. Except when something like the Boston bombings happen, when we suddenly want to know why the government didn't do more. The opposition said that the government loses data, that the government will leak the data. But they haven't provided us with any facts to show the same. They said that if you can't police the shadows, don't police the surface, which, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid isn't the case. Thank you.
The government has lost about 25 million child benefit records, so the government can't be trusted in terms of that. And there's a question about we don't need privacy because we can use the dark web. This is an example of how infringing on people's privacy rights encourages them to seek safer means of communication. You're driving innocent people underground, and more extreme ways will be found to keep hold of that right to privacy. We should be cynical about some things. It's important to question authority in democracy. It's important to challenge information coming from only one source. We must remember that it is ideas that have changed the world. And despite the fact that the proposition keep going on about how this is a time of war, there is always time for ideas, and this is applicable in a time like this where we need a cultural change in this battle.
So Kim, can I start off with you, please? Your feedback to Akshay and Rashi.
I liked, although I did get a bit fed up with the structure, so I really liked when you started off and you said, I've got these 4 key points, but then I got a bit fed up with I'm going to answer in two halves kind of thing. I thought that the trick that you missed really was this stuff about checks and balances, and I wasn't really convinced by you were asking me to take on board that the state and its representatives can be trusted, and you gave some examples, but at the end of the day I didn't really hear enough about accountability, transparency, other measures for us to keep in check those who you want to give all this power to. And I felt that really that's the area where you could have perhaps better developed your argument. But I very much enjoyed your contributions. I thought you used the statistics well. You're both excellent speakers.
Unlike my other judges, I've never been a judge on debating matters before. And I won't tell you what I was expecting, but I was just so pleased that it was brilliant. You know, I thought on both sides you were just so good. So it sounded like the crux of your argument was really that security is so valuable that sacrificing or compromising some of our privacy is okay. And I thought you made a good case for that. You used very good specific examples and statistics, which I thought was great, especially of where surveillance really is working. And your imagery, I thought, was particularly good, especially, Arushi, when you use an image of the murderer or the security guard. I did find perhaps the tone a little reactionary sometimes, a bit hawkish. But actually, I would also say you made really good use of your time by speaking extra fast.
I wasn't blown away by your opening presentations. I think you set out the argument well and the structure. I was much more impressed by the way you came back over the course of the discussion and made some very strong points. Actually, at one point, I think you confused security and privacy, just the words. You talked about the government sacrificing security when you meant privacy a couple of times. I think we all know what you meant, so that was fine. But again, there's danger to speaking too fast sometimes, you know. But I think the points that most impressed me coming back were about the idea that democracy is a check on the excesses of government, which is optimistic, but I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think, as Angela said, you used statistics well and responded well to the opposition's argument that statistics can't be believed by saying that they're backed up by facts and events. I think that was strong. It came across nicely. Arushi's example of the frisking culture in airports was very good, just to give that sense of the relative nature of privacy, which I think is very good. And again, coming back saying, if we can't police the shadows doesn't mean we shouldn't police the surface. I think that's a very important point. So a number of these points came through. It wasn't so much a knockout blows, but I think you've got some points, and we'll talk about the other side's points in a few minutes.
Kim, your feedback for Josh and Lily.
Yes, I thought you started off with a lot of interesting points. I wasn't sure about the battlefield of human rights. I think I've probably heard the war metaphor on both sides used perhaps more often than I would have liked. But You convinced me on some of your arguments. I think perhaps the area where I would have liked to have to have got in a bit more detail, and you were just beginning towards the end, was this business about the need for a cultural change. You must have said that about 3 times, and I still don't really know exactly what you mean by that in detail. Because this, after all, is the alternative you're offering to the other side's, surveillance and security. So I think it deserved more attention than you were able to give it, perhaps. I thought that you did have some really good phrases. I loved your phrase, Josh. It really made me think, rights not returned, even in a time of peace. And I thought there were some really good interventions, and actually this was true for both sides, when you were questioning one another, and I really enjoyed that toing and froing. I thought that was very effective.
Yeah, I also thought you two were great, really, really good. It sounded as though you picked a very good jump-off point for this, which is that we're defending a way of life, that this is a culture that we're trying to defend, and that's why privacy is so important. And I thought your use of historical quotes and history was really good, really, really good. But at the same time, I thought maybe there was a lack of evidence sometimes. So when you're making assertions about surveillance not working, I thought it was quite weak. Your claim was made weaker by the fact that you didn't have any proof of that. But all in all, I thought your interplay with the other team when you were sparring was excellent.
Josh, I don't think life in Bristol is that bad. But having said that, I think that the point you were making about the appeal of a culture is the strongest one. That was I think, very important, and it did come in several times. I think maybe you could have taken it a little bit further, because what you didn't really do was to argue that reducing privacy would actually damage that cultural aspect. And I think if you'd done that, if you said not only does it not work, but it makes things worse, that would have been much stronger. You didn't quite get that far. But certainly you made the points about the inefficacy. Of course, though, the fact that some terrorists get through the loop doesn't mean that it's not worth doing anything, perhaps. So I think it's a case of making the case that it's doing damage. That was the strong thing. But certainly, I think it was relevant to say that there have been examples of times when it hasn't worked. And Josh's point about the Hobbesian point was very good, very strong coming across. Is this what you want? Having said that, you got quite a good comeback from the other side. But well, I think the judges are still to discuss what we made of that. But it was certainly an enjoyable performance.
Thank you. Can we give our judges a round of applause, please? Kim, I believe you've been given the job. Let us know, firstly, why the losers lost, why the winners won, and then finally, the winner.
We wanted to give the verbal prize for the best question to Lily, the question about debt being the biggest threat and the price of security, which we thought was an absolutely excellent question. We loved this side's use of the great philosophers, the great and good J.S. Mill and Hobbes. We felt that this side had made the stronger ethical case, but not always as pinned down with good evidence as it could have been. On the other side, they get the verbal prize for the best summing up. Arushi's summing up was absolutely fantastic at the end. In their introductions, we felt too much tugging on the heartstrings, rather strident and angry, perhaps a little bit too much focus on structure, but overall, we felt, and we were unanimous in our decision, that the arguments were won by the Indian team.
PSBB Nagar take home the trophy. That's 4-2 to India. Can we get all of you down to get the trophy? A spectacular victory. Congratulations to the whole team.